My name is John Kerr, and I'm the moderator for this session. And I think we're going to find this extremely fascinating. Our speaker is Dr. Jerry Thompson, who is the Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M International University in Laredo. And Dr. Thompson has written very extensively on the fascinating topic of the participation of Latinos in the Civil War. He's the recipient of numerous prizes and awards, received twice the Best Scholarly Book Award of the Texas Institute of Letters. Among his more recent books, his biography of Juan Cortina, entitled Cortina, Defending the Mexican Name in Texas, received numerous awards. His book, Tejanos in Gray, The Civil War Letters of Captains Manuel Iturria and Rafael de Garza, and then more recently his Tejano Tiger, Jose de los Santos Benavides, was actually nominated as a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. He is a former president of the Texas State Historical Association and currently serves on the editorial board of the Southwestern Historical Quarterly and on the board of the Texas Institute of Letters. Dr. Thompson is going to speak with us this morning primarily on the participation of Tejanos in the Civil War, who fought primarily on the side of the Confederacy in Texas, which I find very fascinating. He's also written extensively about the participation of Latinos in the Civil War in New Mexico, who were fighting on the Union side. He will speak about the best-known unit of Tejanos was in the Texas Regiment of Colonel Benavides of Laredo, who became the highest-ranking Mexican Texan in the Confederate Army. Other companies of Tejanos enlisted in the Confederate Army from the lower Rio Grande Valley, the lower Nueces River, as well as San Antonio and Bexar County. And then interestingly, following the Union invasion of Texas in late 1863, many of the Tejanos, as I understand it, switched sides and and joined the Union Army forces in Texas. So join me in welcoming Dr. Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'm happy to be in San Antonio. In fact, at my age, I'm happy to be anywhere. I can't think of a place I'd rather be, maybe sitting by the roadside at Wild Rose Pass in the Davis Mountains or something. Shelby Foote, who needs no introduction to people who know something about the Civil War, said that anyone who wants to know something about the country has to know something about the Civil War. That the Civil War remains buried in the very soul of our nation, especially people of the South, and in the idea of the lost cause. From Mississippi, Foote said that during his lifetime, he must have had at least 50 fistfights, and somehow he only remembered the ones he lost. If you can for a second, try to imagine a war that took the lives of 620,000 Americans, almost as many as all the other American wars combined. And remember that 620,000 dead Americans came out of a population of 30 million, some of them 4 million slaves. Imagine a battle called Gettysburg, the largest ever fought in the Western Hemisphere, where 24,000 men and boys in blue and gray became casualties in 3 days. Almost as many Americans died at Antietam in September 1862, the bloodiest day in the Civil War, even more so than died in D-Day and on 9/11. 7,000 Union soldiers were killed at Cold Harbor, Virginia in the summer of 1864 in less than 30 minutes. One of the few really mistakes that Ulysses S. Grant admitted to in his memoirs. 1 in 5 Southern white males perished in the war. Can you imagine headlines like that today and the clamor that it would cause across this nation? Let me focus a little bit on the Civil War in San Antonio, which I admittedly do not know that much about, but it was advertised as such, and then I'll move on to something I do know. As you know, the secession vote in Bexar County was 827 to 709, which is relatively close compared to the rest of the state. That's a vote of 53.8% for secession compared to a statewide vote of 76.8. We know that the large Union vote in the city came primarily from the German community. The German community in San Antonio, as everybody knows, I think, was very, very literate. They were somewhat the intellectual elite. They had a highly developed ethnic identity. Many read local newspapers such as the Zeitung or even the Zeitung from New Braunfels. The San Antonio Herald, which was published by James Newcomb, who had previously published a newspaper called the Alamo Star. You'll see that he's kind of one of my heroes. He found that the Herald had become a bit too pro-secessionist. So Newcomb kind of stormed off and began starting newspapers on his own, especially one, a semi-weekly, right before the Civil War in 1859 called The Union. And also the Tejano community that we'll talk about in a moment. I'm not into selling books or I'd die of starvation. But those letters that I edited of Rafael de la Garza and Manuel Ituria are really, really amazing coming from the Ituria family here in San Antonio. We'll see how the Civil War deeply divided the Tejano community. But let me get back to that in just a moment. 10 counties north and west of San Antonio, as you know, voted against secession. A friend of mine recently found, I need to give him credit for this, he recently found where Maverick County voted against secession, which would make it the only border county to do so. And I said, well, where did you find that? And he said, well, by mistake, the returns from Eagle Pass were stuck in the Presidio County returns, and they arrived in San Antonio, in Austin, a little bit too late to be tabulated. So that's a little footnote to Texas history that is really, really fascinating, that most of those border communities, predominantly Tejano, voted overwhelmingly for secession. And I think there's a reason for that, which I'll explain in a moment. I think largely in the fact that some of those counties, such as Webb County, where I live, Zapata County downriver, Starr County downriver, Hidalgo, Cameron, were largely controlled by political patrons who were closely associated with the political establishment in Austin. And when those individuals shook their fingers, people who worked for them felt responsibility to vote as they did. We know that there was a county in East Texas, Angelina, that voted against secession, and that's never really been satisfactorily explained. There were 8 counties on the Red River, and in that next tier of counties that also voted against secession, and there's been scholarship to explain that. But despite the overwhelming vote for secession in Texas, James Newcomb, this hero of mine, would always insist that the majority of people in Texas were pro-union. Now, I don't think so. Maybe a majority of the people in San Antonio came close to being pro-union. But on August the 18th, 1860, the day Sam Houston withdrew his name as a candidate for president under the Constitutional Union Party, Newcomb established the Alamo Express, dismayed at the secessionist tendencies of the Herald and other Democratic-leaning newspapers in the area. He predicted falsely, of course, that John Bell would be elected president, and John Bell carried a few electoral votes and little more. And then came the election of Lincoln, the secession of South Carolina, the secession of the Deep South, and then Texas in February 1861. And then in San Antonio, General David Twiggs surrendered some 2,700 troops in Texas. There's been a lot written on that. That is really a controversial event. Allegedly, Twiggs said that Twiggs was an older man from Georgia that was ill part of the time, and said that if a little old lady in a broom came, he would surrender Texas. But I edited the journal of a major in the United States Army at that time by the name of Samuel Peter Hyneman, who was with the 2nd Infantry in Texas and stationed mostly up at Camp Verde in the lower valley. And he became very, very close with Robert E. Lee. They were fighting Cortina down in the lower valley. And when Lee appeared in San Antonio and saw several excited men running around with red badges pinned to their jackets, he asked what was going on, and he was told what had happened, what Twiggs had done. And several observers said that Lee had tears in his eyes and repeated several times, "Has it come to this? Has it come to this?" Hyneman, who was able to get out of Texas before the surrender of Twiggs, later had lunch with Lee at his Arlington mansion across the Potomac from the Capitol. Hyneman said, while the ladies were in the Rose Garden. So I guess the ladies were not privy to this political discussion. But he said in his diary that Lee told him frankly, quote, "Had I been in command of the federal forces in Texas, I would never have surrendered." And I have always found that fascinating and just love to speculate on that. Had Lee been in command, as he had been before because Twiggs was frequently ill, the Civil War could easily have started right here in San Antonio and not at Fort Sumter. And I think Lee would have remained loyal to the Union. I think he would have had to remain loyal to the Union, and not, as he said later, could not lift my sword against my native Virginia. I think the Civil War might even have been over as early as, say, 1862 or certainly by 63, had Lee been in charge of the Army of the Potomac and known what to do with it. Lee was in a meeting with Edmund J. Davis, and you'll recognize Edmund J. Davis as the man behind the Texas Union Army and the man who became probably the most hated governor in Texas history, although the scholarship indicates today that he was a pretty good guy and a pretty efficient administrator. But he said in this San Antonio meeting between Davis and Lee with Newcomb standing there watching, Davis said, "I told Lee point blank that the preservation of the Union was paramount to all other considerations." Rising to his feet, Lee paced the floor, saying that he knew Davis was correct and that the thought of secession would lead to the suicide of the South and a disaster for the people of the South. But just as he later said, "I could not lift my sword against my native Virginia." Newcomb worked hard in his newspapers to defend the Germans in San Antonio and condemn the racist Knights of the Golden Circle. On May the 13th, he issued an extra of the Alamo Express in which he was highly critical of Twiggs's surrender and put a little bit of poking fun in there, saying, well, you know, these guys had already agreed to leave Texas. They were marching from these western forts as far away as Fort Bliss and Fort Davis and Fort Stockton and Fort Quitman, and they had already agreed to leave Texas, and you go out to Adams Hill and make them surrender. This was less than a great battle, he said. Well, that night, a mob of Confederate Rangers and Knights of the Golden Circle broke into his office, destroyed the press, and set fire to the building. Shortly after the destruction of his newspaper, which was the last Union newspaper in Texas, a plot for the hanging or banishment of 150 Union men was discovered, and Newcomb was one of the men on that list that was scheduled to be hanged. So he fled San Antonio the very next day, making his way west and then south to Eagle Pass, eventually to Monterrey, and then across Monterrey, Mexico, all the way to Mazatlan, where he caught a steamboat for California. And in California, he joined Colonel James H. Carleton's Union California column, and then proceeded to march all the way back across the Sonoran Desert to the Rio Grande and the Mesilla Valley to help drive the Texans out of New Mexico territory. Newcomb would return to San Antonio in April of 1867 and would help to edit the San Antonio Daily Express as well as the Weekly Express. Samuel Peter Hyneman, who had risen to the rank of Major General during the Civil War and in command of one of the corps in the Army of the Potomac, came back to Texas after the war during Reconstruction in command of the 17th U.S. Infantry stationed in San Antonio. And on July the 4th, 1866, he arranged for a parade he hoped would joyously symbolize the reunification of the country that began and ended at Military Plaza. And he said that although the German population were quite joyous over the occasion and hung out all their stars and stripes, I guess they had just hidden these away in a basement or something, he complained that not one former secessionist put out a flag or, quote, joined the celebration. But at a picnic in San Pedro Springs to celebrate Juneteenth, the liberation of the Texas slaves, General Gordon's proclamation at Galveston, he said he watched intensely as, quote, an ex-rebel captain danced among the Negroes. So perhaps there was a changing of the tide there. Let me switch gears for just a moment and talk a little bit about the uniqueness, I think, of Texas during that 1861-1865 Civil War period of American history. First of all, the Union Army in Texas was always on the periphery. They were at El Paso. They were at Galveston. They were at Brownsville. They were at Corpus Christi. No armies in blue marched through Austin or Houston or San Antonio or major Texas communities. The vastness of the state gave it almost a sense of invincibility. Texas simply did not witness the destruction that other states of the Confederacy, such as Virginia or Tennessee or Georgia or South Carolina, saw. And I think this helps to explain why it was so difficult for a lot of Texans to accept defeat in May of 1865. And then another unique feature is the frontier experience. Texas is really the only Confederate state that had that really frontier experience, maybe a little bit of Arkansas, but not much. So the state assumed the responsibility for protecting the frontier and maintaining forts and camps there. At the same time, they're fighting in the east, in Virginia, in Tennessee. In 1861, they garrisoned all of the forts on the San Antonio to El Paso Road, including all the posts in the Trans-Pecos, such as Fort Bliss, Fort Stockton, Fort Davis. The Native Americans seemed to sense what was happening and began pushing at that frontier. And there's some scholarship that indicates that they may have pushed it back as much as 100 miles, with things like the Elm Creek raid in Young County in North Texas in 1864 that left a dozen Texans dead. Or 2 years earlier in 1862, Mescalero Apache wiped out an entire company of Confederates in the Chisos Mountains in the heart of the Big Bend. Or there's Dove Creek in January of 1865, when 160 Confederates and 325 state militiamen attacked 600 migrating Kickapoo 20 miles southwest of modern-day San Angelo, did not realize that the Indians were peaceful and were trying to get out of Texas and make their way to Mexico. And in that confrontation, the Confederates and the militia were decisively defeated. was one of the worst defeats at the hands of Native Americans in the history of the state. And then all of us have heard of the Battle of Adobe Walls, but a lot of us don't know much about the 1864 Adobe Walls battle between Christopher Kit Carson, who brought several regiments out of New Mexico to attack the Comanche on the Canadian River. And that battle, the first Battle of Adobe Walls, 1864, came very, very close to being a larger version of the Little Bighorn somewhat 2 decades later. At one point in that confrontation, the Comanche, with their assistance of the Kiowa, actually had Carson and his New Mexico soldiers completely surrounded. We also need to remember that Texas was the only Confederate state that had a foreign border. Lincoln's blockade helped spawn the lucrative Texas cotton trade. And where I'm from in Laredo, when I first came there many years ago, you would talk to people who had, mothers and fathers who had lived through this period, and they never talked about the Civil War. They all talked about the cotton times, which, if you were in the right position, was a time of, believe it or not, quite good prosperity, although other parts of the state certainly were suffering. Some of that cotton came to the border from as far away as Arkansas and Louisiana, would be crossed at Eagle Pass, Laredo, Rio Grande City, then taken down the South Bank, or if it was crossed at Brownsville, it could be taken downriver, or at Roma or Rio Grande City, could be taken downriver by steamer. Usually the cotton would be brought as far west as Hempstead and then unloaded and put on wagons there, or at Alleyton West and southwest of Houston. I think one of the great untold stories that's beginning to be untold, that's out there but has never really been comprehended, is the persecution of the German Unionists during the Civil War. And when Maury Maverick used to write in San Antonio, he was always getting in trouble for talking about the German community. And Maury would always insist that the majority of the Germans were Unionist. Well, I think maybe 50% may have been Unionist, but if you do an analysis, more Germans joined the Confederate Army from places like New Braunfels and San Antonio and communities east of San Antonio than the Germans in the hill country, who were more the latecomers, many of whom fled to Mexico. So I think the Civil War deeply divided the German Texans the way it deeply divided the Tejano community. An excellent place to begin discussion of the Tejano community is to talk about numbers, and this is something I know a little bit more about. I estimate that about 4,000, maybe 4,200, 300 Tejanos joined the Confederate Army. 956 joined the Union Army. And I've worked on 2 biographies. In fact, let me be a bit biographical for just a second, a bit egotistical. I got the brilliant idea about 25 years ago of writing a dual biography of these 2 guys, Juan Cortina and Santos Benavides, because I had seen that done with, Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee and Woodrow Wilson and Theodore Roosevelt and so on and so on. But the more I got into this, Cortina became to so overshadow Benavides, became mayor of Tamaulipas twice, a liberal in the army of Benito Juarez, and Benavides was a legislator in Austin, although be it the only Tejano in the legislature in 1879. So I wound up writing separate biographies, and I took on Cortina first, and he by far was the most difficult. But what I found was 2 men from 2 different worlds. Cortina was born on the south bank of the river at Camargo, came of age on his mother's ranch about 10 miles above Brownsville. Benavides was also born at about the same time, but he was born in Laredo on the north bank. They both came from prominent families. Santos Benavides was the great-great-grandson of the man who founded Laredo. Cortina was the great-great-grandson of one of the alcaldes of Camargo. But these two men went in totally opposite directions. Cortina became the rebel. Benavides became the man who cooperated with the political establishment in Austin. Cortina actually started a war in the lower Rio Grande Valley, one of the few men to have a war named after him. And I looked at the Cameron County records very carefully, and I could not find, with one exception, a Spanish surnamed individual who served in any public office, either in the county of Cameron or the city of Brownsville, even in grand juries, between 1848 and 1861. And I looked at those same records in Webb County, which is Laredo, and by 1851, the Benavides family and their friends and relatives were already firmly in control of local politics and controlled politics throughout the decade of the 50s. So Laredo was a very, very unique community for any of you who have been there. It is predominantly Hispanic. It has always been predominantly Hispanic. And outsiders have always been in a small minority there. And for outsiders to succeed, like Benavides' brother-in-law, John Z. Leindecker, you had to come there, preferably marry into one of the better families there. You were the ones who had to become acculturated. You had to learn Spanish. What happened in the lower valley after the war with Mexico is that the outsiders just moved in and just basically took over, either Americans from the frontier or people coming directly from Europe. And so this helped to produce two different people. And this helped to split the community during the Civil War. 956 men out of the lower valley, and I think they recruited some from the South Bank, joined the Union Army when the Union Army arrived there in late '63, whereas everybody upriver in places like Zapata County, Webb County, everybody there joined the Confederate Army. Another thing about the Tejano community is that I think it was deeply divided over the question of slavery. I had a graduate student that found 54 Spanish surnamed individuals who owned slaves either in 1850 or 1860, most of them in the San Antonio area, including the prominent Novato, Seguin families, and some others. But at the same time, there's evidence that there's a little mini underground railroad in which Tejanos are openly cooperating in helping runaway slaves escape into Mexico. Rip Ford said that in Mexico, and many of the communities there were hundreds of these runaway slaves. On the other hand, Santos Benavides, on at least two occasions that I can document, and probably on more, actually went into Mexico and grabbed runaway slaves and returned them to their owners in Texas, sometimes for $300, which was a lot of money back in the 1850s. But you can find all kinds of crazy things in the Texas newspapers. Supposedly the Hispanics are in Guadalupe County are in revolt, and you don't know how much of that is exaggerated and how much of it isn't. But that battle, that war in the lower Rio Grande Valley is one that I've tended to really concentrate on because I find it so very, very fascinating. And especially that 7,000-man Union Rio Grande expedition that came there. And you say, well, what was the Union Army doing in Texas? Well, what were they doing at Galveston or El Paso? They wanted to wave the stars and stripes, I think, at the French. Now, Lincoln is not dumb enough to know that he can intervene in Mexico to drive out the imperialists. But I think he can certainly send Maximilian a powerful signal that, hey, you are in violation of the Monroe Doctrine. And there's open cooperation between the Union Army and the liberals in Mexico, and open cooperation between the Confederates and the French in Mexico. That's another great story that needs to be told in greater detail. But I think that Union Army also came to the lower valley to provide a safe haven for those Unionists who were fleeing out of the hill country in large numbers. And we all, of course, know about the Nueces massacre and so on and so on and so on. But it's there in 1865 that the war comes to an end. But let me talk about something very quickly that San Antonio is very much involved in. I wrote a book on a Confederate general by the name of Henry Hopkins Sibley, who was a major out in New Mexico when the Civil War began. And he came up with the brilliant idea, once he resigned, of going back east, where he persuaded Jefferson Davis to allow him to come back to San Antonio, and he would recruit several thousand zealous, overexcited, mostly Texas farm boys, and they would go march all the way along that overland trail that you heard about earlier, march all the way out to New Mexico. They would seize New Mexico territory, where Sibley was sure that the native population there, the Hispanics, would remain neutral at best and maybe even join with him because they didn't like the federal government. And they would use New Mexico as a springboard to go into Colorado, where they would seize the silver mines there, and then eventually march all the way to California, where they would get their hands on some of the gold there, but also their hands on those Pacific ports. And the theory was, at least in Sibley and Jefferson's mind, was that if you could create this transcontinental nation stretching all the way from Richmond, San Francisco, from Savannah to Los Angeles, you would have a much better chance of obtaining British and French diplomatic recognition, which had to be a step toward gaining the independence that you're fighting this war for. And of course, as you know, the Texans marched all the way out there, got out there by Christmas of 61, invaded New Mexico territory, defeated the Union Army at the Battle of Valverde, the largest battle ever fought in the Rocky Mountain West. And interestingly enough, in that Confederate Army was a company from San Antonio that was commanded by this guy Pyron, Charles Lynn Pyron, a pretty distinguished guy, that contained large numbers, I think 54 Tejanos. And so in that Battle of Valverde, you've got that strange situation there, kind of like the lower valley, of where Tejanos are fighting New Mexico Hispanics. It's a civil war almost within a civil war. And then, of course, the Texans seize Albuquerque, raised the stars and bars over the capital at Santa Fe, and then began marching on Fort Union across Glorieta Pass, which was the big supply base for the entire Southwest. And right there in Glorieta Pass, the Colorado volunteers came down and stopped them in their tracks. And while there's a ferocious battle going on around a place called Pigeon's Ranch, John M. Shivington, the guy later infamous for the Sand Creek Massacre, slips around through the mountains and falls down on the Confederate supply train in Apache Canyon there. And with the smoke from that Confederate supply train went Henry Hopkins Sibley's hopes for creating a Confederate empire in the American Southwest. And when you read the retreat of that Sibley column from New Mexico, it's one of the most pitiful things you can imagine. Most of the guys lost their horses. They're out of food. They're plundering that entire Rio Grande Valley from Albuquerque to El Paso, stripping the valley clean of animals, food, taking furniture out of people's houses and burning it for firewood, everything imaginable. And then they've got to make that desert march from El Paso to San Antonio. And those guys literally begin to starve. And along comes the Mescalero Apache and began taking sheep carcasses and stuffing those in all the water holes. And you can imagine walking through that desert for 12 hours in summer degree heat of 105, and you get just ready to have some water, and there's a putrid sheep carcass. But the people of San Antonio did send out supply trains that would meet those people several hundred miles west of San Antonio with food and supplies and everything possible. How much time have we got? 12 minutes. Maybe we should stop at this point, and I know we have some questions. You can even ask about moving statues. Should we be moving those statues around? Any questions? Surely somebody is inspired to ask at least one question. Yes, sir.
The one thing we were talking about a little bit earlier, Texas was a sort of a major provider of cotton and beef
Yeah,
during the Civil War.
yeah.
Most of that was going through Mexico and then ending up elsewhere, or how did that all come to pass?
Yeah. They would take that cotton down the south bank of the river, and right there at the mouth of the river on the Mexican side sprang up this little community. It was a little fishing village before the war, and it just sprang up almost overnight. Some of the accounts say there were as many as 20,000 people there. They called the place, of all things, Baghdad. And ships from all over the world came there to take on this Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas cotton and bring goods in too. Firearms from Europe, for example. And of course, that's beyond Lincoln's blockade. And so I looked at some of the manifests of some of those ships that are on record at the Brownsville Historical Society, and I found something very interesting. A large number of those ships arriving at Baghdad, Mexico, to buy southern cotton were coming out of Boston and New York and Providence. And so the Yankees were buying lots of Texas cotton, and I'm wondering how many boys in blue were able to warm their backs during the winter during the Civil War with that Texas cotton. And I just found that very, very interesting. Now there were ships coming out of Cuba and Bremerhaven and Londonderry and Liverpool and elsewhere in the world, but there were a lot of those ships taking on that Texas cotton that were coming from the north. And Bruce is still here. One of the other things that's fascinating is that kind of in the origins of that Goodnight Loving Trail, some of those cowboys out there in West Texas were selling beef to those Union contractors in New Mexico at Fort Sumter, because what Carleton had done there was gather up about 8,000 Navajo, march them hundreds of miles away from their homeland, and basically put them in a concentration camp on the Pecos there at the Bosque Redondo. And the Army has to have some way to feed the Navajo because they're already starving when they got there. And that's another interesting little footnote to Texas history, are those West Texas cowboys selling all that beef to the Union Army during the war. How's that for loyalty to the Stars and Bars?
There's a fascinating map in the National Archives of Confederate plans to fortify San Antonio with 5 gigantic earthwork forts and then the downtown area full of entrenchments. But Sam Maverick later writes a note that says they can't get the local men to work on the forts. And so, if you're going to have people dig gigantic earthwork forts in a town that wasn't very pro-Confederate, apparently they didn't show up to dig the trenches.
Yeah, and on the coast they just conscripted black slaves. They were planning to also build some of those big fortifications just south of Austin. But yes, the Texas cities were concerned about being occupied by Union troops. That is true. That is certainly true.
I'd like to have you say a little bit more about your speculation about Lee, if he had been in command in Texas, might have ended up as the head of the Army of the Potomac.
Well, I don't know,
because I'd always attributed his actions to his ties to Virginia, and even if he had been in command here, assuming he would have survived, what makes you think that he wouldn't have still gone in with the Confederacy after that?
You may be right. I'm not 100% sure of that. It just seems that if there had been a fight here, and he had been in command, and that fight had become somewhat bloody, as I think it would, because those Texans who occupied San Antonio and demanded Twiggs's surrender, they were pretty determined. Guys like John Robert Baylor, for example. Baylor was a real fighter, an Indian hater, but he was a real fighter. So I just somehow think that had Lee committed himself to that point, that it would have been more difficult for him to tell Lincoln no. Now, I may be wrong. It could be that being a Virginian just overpowers everything else. What do you think, to use the old Freudian thing?
I think the Virginia ties were awfully strong, and while I couldn't rule out
Yeah. Yeah. You may be right. Why don't you ask something that I know, Jim? Was Lee in contact with Governor Houston? I'll have to get back to you on that one.
Regarding the cotton trade again, now that records are more available in Cuba, are you aware of any scholarship for anybody trying to trace the cotton shipments as they might have traversed through Cuba?
No, but wouldn't that be fascinating? And I
Yes.
mean, there is a lot of that, because a lot of those ships leaving Baghdad are bound for Havana, but Havana
Right.
is only a stopping place.
Right.
Yeah. And you know, those Cotton Bureau records in Texas are now available.
Yes.
And those are immense. Those are immense, and they're difficult, but they need to be really studied beyond what historians have done.
Thank you.
Can you tell us something about the economic impact on San Antonio during the Civil War, the impact of the war itself, good, bad, whatever?
You know, one of the not so good things is that those San Antonio newspapers, which I think are the most reliable source for learning about San Antonio during the war, and I know there's, you know, there are these letters that I've edited, and the Maverick letters are out there, and there's some German letters that are out there. But unfortunately, those Texas newspapers in 63 and 64 and 65 become scattered and just to the point of almost non-existent. But I think we can make the assumption that the suffering in San Antonio would probably have been to the same extent as it was in other Texas cities, and it was not good. I mean, in some places you've got near starvation, you've got chaos, I mean, we've all heard of the great Gainesville hanging, where they're just hanging these Unionists in North Texas. That's as bad as the Nueces massacre that we know about. But I think the economy, to put it mildly, just went to hell. I mean, inflation just became runaway. Everything that Sam Houston predicted in 1861 became exactly true. Now, there were some people like the Benavides family in Laredo. Santos Benavides prospered. Richard King and Mifflin Kennedy prospered by buying, boats that were running through the Union blockade. That's another little footnote to history. I always love to give these footnotes. I tell the students it didn't come with their tuition, they're free. After the Civil War, if you had been a high-ranking Confederate, if you wanted to do any kind of business or get anywhere in politics, you had to file these amnesty petitions. So if you read those King and Kennedy amnesty petitions, they are the damnedest things. You could swear that Civil War wasn't within 10 miles of those guys. They had absolutely nothing to do with it. And yet we have evidence that King was at least a captain in a militia company. So a lot of people, I think, suffered, but a lot of people did quite wealthy, especially people who were in the cotton trade. I think so. It depended on who you were, what you were doing, etc.
I was going to comment on the question that was asked earlier about the archives in Cuba. I have found Spanish colonial archives that were from Cuba at the University of Miami archives. Now, I don't know whether they have, post-colonial records, but it seems they have quite an extensive collection at the University of Miami Archives. And I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you.
One of the things that I have found very valuable are those consular archives. To look at what those consuls in Nuevo Laredo, Camargo, Reynosa, and Matamoros have to say. And I even looked at the British consular records out of Matamoros, Tamaulipas, and Tampico. But for some reason, the British were a lot more disappointing. They didn't keep as good a records as the Americans did. But some of those American consul records are really, really quite well done. There's a guy in Matamoros, for example, by the name of Pierce, who is a Maine Yankee. And boy, when those Germans arrive there, they're in pretty destitute condition. I mean, they're hungry, they're out of clothing, they're desperate. And he has a huge fund there where he's bringing those people in, feeding them, giving them clothes, and then putting them on the next steamboat bound for New Orleans. And in New Orleans, a lot of them are then enlisting in the Union Army, either in the First Texas Union Cavalry, or some of them would enlist, very few, in the Second Texas Union Cavalry. That was the one that was predominantly Tejano. That First Texas Cavalry was made up either of old Unionist men from the old Army or Germans from the hill country. But that's another piece of Texas history that we just don't read much about, or those Texans like, Davis and John L. Haynes who fought in the Union Army. And I tend to admire those guys. They left their families behind in Texas. That took a lot of guts to try and flee into Mexico and then make your way to New Orleans. And some of them went all the way to Washington to try and influence Lincoln.
If I've got a question related to East Texas, if I could push you there, and it goes to cotton and economics as well, because we know that especially after the Emancipation Proclamation, we have a number of slaves being brought into Texas to protect slaves. And so does that tie into the Texas cotton economy in that period? In other words, they're not being brought in largely male slaves, so field workers. They're not being brought in to sit there, I assume. So I'm assuming that they're actually productively employed in that economy. So does that fit in to maybe a Texas micro cotton economy? And that would be the question. And the comment would be, I think you made a great distinction between, let's say, Nuevo Mexicanos and Tejanos, and there's a difference. It's an ethnicity, but there's a difference in thoughts. One could say the same about, I think, Germans in Texas, right? You have confessional differences. You have differences in those communities. So I think we have to be kind of careful when we say Texas Germans or German Texans, right? We have to make those distinctions just like you did with the Hispanic communities.
Yes, we need to be very careful with the Tejano community, the German community. There was a well-done documentary several years ago that depicted the arrival of Stephen F. Austin in Texas, and he's beginning to bring these black slaves with him. And there's a scene there where it shows a couple of the women are just abhorrent by this and how the Tejano community just reacted with revulsion. And that's amazing to me because that family, the Seguin family, had slaves. But to answer your question specifically, there is a book, and I'm not the authority on this, but one of the better books says that during the Civil War, East Texas was crowded with as many as 400,000 slaves who had been brought by their masters or fled across the Mississippi from other states. And the assumption is that, they would not have gone back to Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama or Tennessee or somewhere. But I don't know, I can't give you a definitive answer on that, but I think, yeah, you're right.
Jerry, with regard to that question just now about a microeconomy, there was a really good article in the Southwestern Historical Quarterly a few years ago about the economy of Houston during the Civil War.
Yeah, that's right.
And Houston had a very different experience than San Antonio because they were exporting so much, cotton especially. They had a thriving economy. I mean, little girls were taking piano lessons and all kinds of extracurricular things were going on. One of the men who made a lot of money out of that trade has a name that's on the ring on my finger. Can you guess who it is? It's William Marsh Rice, the founder of Rice University.
That's slaveholder.
And cotton exporter. He made a bunch of money during the Civil War. By
Are you one of the
shipping-
guys that moved his statue around, Jim?
I'll keep the ring, no tattoos.
You know the story of the Rice students somehow moved the statue around and nobody at Rice University could figure out how they did it. Go ahead, Jim's going to
No,
tell us
I
how.
was there. I was a history major, not an engineer, so I didn't help them move it. But
Well,
what
how
they
did they do
did
it?
in the middle of the night was they built a frame and lifted the statue of William Marsh Rice up from his tomb and turned it around facing the library instead of facing Lovett Hall and put it back down. And then the university had to spend $10,000 to get an engineering company to turn it around. And they broke part of the base while they were trying to do it. The Rice students didn't hurt anything. At Rice, they called practical jokes jacks. And I've been a victim of and perpetrator of jacks. And this is known as the greatest jack in the history of Rice University.
I have a true Rice story very quickly. I know this, we want more than humor. My son, who thought he was about the most brilliant student in the world, made the mistake of enrolling in Rice and all of a sudden became terribly mediocre and enrolled in freshman honors chemistry, and on the first exam he made a shocking 67, and he said there was a man sitting next to him who he got to talking to who was an older man in his 70s who was a retired PhD in chemistry from UT, who said that he wanted to begin teaching again and was going to start teaching at the community college and wanted a refresher. My son said he looked over and he had made 70 on the exam. The UT PhD. Not to put more relevant questions.
One more question on
Yes.
on the cotton trade. Are you familiar with George W. Brackenridge's involvement in the cotton trade and shipping contraband?
Just know about it is all.
Well, he too, like Rice, made a large fortune during the war, shipping cotton, contraband cotton from Matamoros, but to New York City, and then toward the end of the war, he was expelled from Texas as a pro-union sympathizer and wound up working for the U.S. Treasury Department in New Orleans. So at the end of the war, there was no question of his loyalty, and he came to San Antonio and were surrounded by everything that he owned and built.
In your readings, did you come across John Tewig, the banker of San Antonio?
Yes.
Can you
And
comment
there
on
is a
him
little
and
book
the
on
role
him,
that
right?
he played in cotton?
I'm sorry, there is a little book on him, a little biography. Yeah. Oh, really? Huh. Another question?
Yes. I have a question about the French intervention in Mexico.
Yes.
And the type of attention it garnered from Tejanos. Do you have a sense of Tejanos in the San Antonio area, what kind of attention they're paying to that versus Tejanos closer to the border in the valley?
Well, they're paying a lot less attention because it's quite remote from them. Once again, I think that Tejano community is very, very split. We've got Rafael de la Garza dying in the Battle of Mansfield leading a Confederate charge, and yet we've got the son of Antonio Novato who just simply got fed up with the discrimination that existed in San Antonio and existed within the Confederate Army, and he actually deserts to Mexico. And we have his letters that he wrote to Governor Santiago Vidal asking that if he can come and stay there, that he just cannot live in Texas anymore. Carmen Tafoya, who will be here later, edited the recollections of a relative of hers, a man who was actually born in New Mexico but came to Texas and enlisted in the Confederate Army here, and he too became somewhat disgusted and fled to Mexico. And there were patrols along the border, including Santos Benavides. They were trying to track down these deserters or these so-called Unionists that were escaping into Mexico. So you'll find Texans and Tejanos serving in both armies. You'll find some serving with Maximilian, and you'll find a handful serving with Benito Juarez. And of course, a lot of those guys who joined the Union Army in the Lower Valley, this really gets confusing, because in 1864, you've got 4 armies operating in the lower Rio Grande Valley. You've got the Confederates who are trying to hold on to Brownsville, the Federals who have landed on Brazos Santiago and are pushing against them and will eventually push them all the way up to Laredo. And then you've got the French who have landed at Baghdad. They're pushing north from San Fernando, and they're pushing all the way in from Monterrey. So it really, really gets confusing there. But you actually have a case there where Cortina crosses his men to the north bank, and they actually fight with the Union Army there for a couple of days. And I think that's the only example I've ever found of a foreign army fighting on American soil during the American Civil War. So a lot of those guys who joined that Union Army in the Lower Valley were ironically men who had fought with Cortina in 1859 against the United States, against Texas, and all of a sudden in 1863-64, they're joining the Union Army. So that war in the Lower Valley can get really, really strange at times. And sometimes it was just opportunity. A lot of those guys who joined the Union Army did it for the bounty money. That's more money than they had ever seen in their lives. I picked up on a story that came out of Zapata County where a man told me that his grandfather heard that they were paying money in Brownsville to enlist, and so he thought he would go and join the Confederate Army. He got to Brownsville and found that the Federals were in command of the town, so he just joined the Union Army. So, what the heck?
In answer to that question about how, if anybody in San Antonio knew what was going on with Maximilian in Mexico, I have a reference that I got out of the Notre Dame archives, and I'm right now writing an article on Francois Bouchou here in San Antonio. He was also in charge of building a church in Greytown, which is south of San Antonio. And in his letter, he writes that since Christmas, Juan Rodriguez and Antonio Seguin were supposed to have collected money for the building of this church. He's already bought the lumber and so forth, but they hadn't collected a cent. And so he basically says, they don't deserve a priest. But I honestly believe that the problem was that he was a French priest, and therefore the feelings of Seguin and Rodriguez reflected that of the Mexican community that were distrustful of the French at the time, because it's written in 1861.
There's some correspondence between Santos Benavides and Santiago Vidadi, where Vidadi talks about he's having to kick these bloodthirsty priests out of Mexico, that they're just not trustworthy and they're just doing terrible, terrible things. And so he wants Santos Benavides to go see the bishop in Galveston to see if the bishop will send him some priests from Texas that wouldn't be so hell-raising and so anti-Santiago Vidadi. Of course, Santiago Vidadi later goes over to the French and gets himself shot, but that's another story.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but so you'll join me in giving Dr. Thompson a big round of applause.